Today, I am joined by Cremieux. He is an anonymous poster, a man who is well versed in statistics and the analysis of statistics, and someone who is part of somewhat of a wave of statistically savvy anonymous accounts on Twitter now that have popped up and been kind of let loose onto the world by the fact that Elon Musk has lifted the ban on wrongthink on Twitter. So yeah, he's blessed us with a lot of interesting insights in the last few months, and I'm very glad to have you on, Camille.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be on. I really appreciate the way you described all that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're on. Obviously, with a voice changer. So whoever is irritated by voice changer, I'm sorry. This is part of the anonymity. This is not the first time this has happened on the show, but people have gotten used to it. And I wonder. I mean, obviously, without telling me anything about your background or what it is that you do in real life, what was the impetus for you to create this account to produce these analyses? Because of what I've seen of your work is that you take data that is already out there, so you're not doing the actual collection of the data, but there are databases and things that you can tap into, and you present the data and interpret it in a way that is quite novel and quite unexpected in many ways. So I wonder what started this with you? Why did you want to participate in this conversation that is suddenly open?
So I'm a researcher and I've been researching, I don't want to say the topic, for years. And behind the scenes, sort of, I've been anonymously DMing people, oh, your houses have this or that problem. Or, oh, did you notice this interesting thing that might inform you about this or that? And it's generally DMing scientists, or it's DMing some anon like Rune, or it's DMing someone. I just telling them like, oh, this is an interesting thing you could think about here or there. And a lot of my friends who I had told about this said that I was wasting my time, not gathering a following. So after enough prodding, I eventually just decided to make a Twitter account where I would share the things I would normally just anonymously post into people's DMs.
Okay, perfect. So you've kind of you went from nudging to creating this persona for yourself. Yeah, I think that's this is the pathway that I've seen a lot of people who are anonymous take from either reply guy, which is a common one, to moving to main poster, or lurker. Many people have lurked for years and then they just break out and produce some epic work. So yeah, I'm happy that you stopped your lurking and your nudging, and now you've moved on to more interesting things. And one thing that I've noticed that you've looked into is, obviously media is littered with all sorts of results of studies that confirm the narrative that, of kind of systemic discrimination. So whatever piece of data looks kind of like it produces, like it's the result of systemic discrimination, this is going to populate a lot of the media about it. So you've heard about, and you've covered this, about the food deserts, which is apparently a sign of systemic discrimination. There was also another result that you looked at was the kind of audit studies on Black names. So people with Black sounding names were called up in interviews more rarely. It's all there are all sorts of results that I think people kind of have seen in the media, but they are interpreted in the sense that, okay, uh, this is an obvious effect of systemic discrimination. So I wonder, reading your work, this is not necessarily how you interpret this. So how might we look at these results in a bit of a different light?
So I'll talk about food deserts first. Food
Yeah.
deserts are one of those things where sociological theory has run awry. It's run amok. It's become so popular, and even today, the concept of the food desert has been used to, get tons and tons of grants issued for all sorts of things. It leads to lots of research and lots of often federally funded programs, lots of Medicaid outreaches, um, done on the basis of research on food deserts. And the general gist is that these people who are obese, who are suffering from not undernutrition, but malnourishment or whatever, they are in areas in which there's just not enough of like good food options. But the reality is that the people who are in those areas have sorted into those areas primarily because they are the sorts of people who want those things. They want all the things that are antecedents of a poor environment. They are more likely to commit crime. They are more likely to act impulsively. They're more likely to get in fights with others. They're more likely to, you know, not stick with a job. That's a very, very dominant one. They're more likely to get divorced. They're more likely to cheat. They're more likely to do every little bad thing. And this leads to an agglomeration of people in certain areas and has nothing to do with the things available to them in those areas. The symptoms of food doesn't have nothing to do with that. It has more to do with just the fact that the people who move to those areas demand those things. They could take advantage of the fact that at any, what would you say, like a Walmart, there are plenty of healthy food options, and they don't have to be malnourished. They don't have to be obese, but they choose to be anyway. I mean, there was a response to that movie, Super Size Me, where in Super Size Me, a man gets obese eating McDonald's for 30 days. And the response, this guy, some libertarian, decides to eat McDonald's for 30 days and loses weight. He becomes a little healthier, and his doctor is utterly shocked. The possibility is a choice. The people who move those areas are um, basically the problems with those areas are an expression of the composition of the area. The people who move there are the problems. There are plenty of people who move out who are not problematic. There are plenty of people in those areas who are not problematic. But it ultimately comes down to choice. Audit studies are a completely separate issue. They are very interesting because they're an area where there's a technique that economists love to use. They love to send out fake resumes. Some people think audit studies are a little unethical because you certainly send out fake resumes. Doesn't really matter. Audit studies, you send out a fake resume, you analyze the difference in callback rates between blacks, whites, immigrants, non-immigrants, women, sexual minorities, anything like that. And then you attribute whatever happens to discrimination. Some people are a little more nuanced with it. They'll say, oh, there's taste-based discrimination, which is the real sort of discrimination, the real, oh, I don't like black people, so I'm not hiring black people. Which is odd because if that's a thing, why would the difference be quantitative? Why would it be like, oh, there's a 2 percentage point difference in callback rates instead of we're just not going to hire black people, so there's a 0% black callback rate? The view you get from audit studies is that discrimination is a quantitative thing. People do it in parts. So they'll go, well, it's nuanced. I'm going to treat this black person as if I don't like them for some reason, and I'm not going to call them back. But if they have a degree, then I'm suddenly going to stop. Like I'm going to forget that I'm racist, and I'm going to call them back. The other view is that there is statistical discrimination, whereby employers see that like, oh, an Asian person is more skilled than a white person if they have the same degree. That can lead to the same result. You can get the same result because somebody might say like women are more qualified in this job, or maybe somebody has a taste-based thing where they say, oh, women are better nurses, so I'm going to really put a little more pressure on men if they want to apply to be a nurse. So we're going to make it easier for women, harder for men, whatever. The difference between these is generally not analyzed or appreciated, and some people don't even care about statistical discrimination. They will simply say that, oh, um, any discrimination is bad, any discrimination is immoral, ethical, etc., etc. And it very well may be. That's a matter of opinion. I don't really want to deal with opinions so much as dealing with the reality of how it happens, why it happens. Because the thing is, by neglecting this difference, you neglect the possibility that there are different strategies to overcome either or. Like for taste-based discrimination, there's a hypothesis that has held up super well. It's called the contact hypothesis, and it's that if you spend more time around people in different groups, you will discriminate against them less. So you could develop an intervention based on this, where you get to like equate people with people of different races or, women or men within their company. And this could help to, lessen their taste-based discrimination. Simple. Now, if you have statistical discrimination, on the other hand, the contact hypothesis might not do anything. It might not help you at all. It might provide you with interventions that are mistargeted, that don't have effects, that are wastes of time, that feel like they're annoying to employees. Some interventions in the workplace that are DEI-led interventions, they make people upset. They make people feel resentful. They make people resent their coworkers. That's not really useful, but it might be what follows from taking an agnostic, oh, all discrimination is bad, we don't understand the difference of view. So it's an under focus. And the methods used to figure out which is which or how to address one or the other, they're absent. They don't exist. There's very little care taken in understanding the minutia here that might matter to make a difference to what these employers, or not these employers, these researchers actually care about. So really what I focus on with audit studies is that there's a lot of carelessness, and this carelessness can be meaningful. It could make the difference between figuring out an intervention that actually does something, or an intervention that does nothing, or an intervention that backfires entirely and causes, pain in the workplace.
Yeah,
Um,
and do you know of any evidence that the contact hypothesis does work or does show any positive results? I mean, just exposure to diversity. Does it have any positive consequences, whatever measure downstream?
Yeah, so that one I was using it more as an example. I don't think it actually has held up very well. There's been what's called a decline effect in the literature of the contact hypothesis. And a decline effect is where the first studies presented, they're affected by something called the winner's curse, or they're just based on small samples, and the effect sizes are enormous. They are so large that you have to really question the researchers. You have to go, oh, you found an effect size of D equals 2? Meaning, like, one of the ways I really like explaining huge effect sizes is Daniel Lawkins once criticized a study of the relationship between country music and suicides. The effect size was like a 0.60. But if it were actually that large in the real world, the implication is that every Dolly Parton concert would be a mass suicide. So the effect that you see in these early studies is usually so large that if you believe it, you're a rube. You are a fool to believe it. There's just no reason to, and if you do, you're silly. So the initial studies in the contact hypothesis that have, the initial empirical studies show effects that were very big, and now the more modern ones show effects that are usually indistinguishable from zero. And for the very small number of pre-registered and large studies, the effects are just indistinguishable from zero. And any effect you can find with like more intensive or specific interventions, that tends to fade out if you assess people again, like a month, 2 months, 3 months later. So that example was maybe a bad example because it's not actually a good example of something that might be helpful, but it's just a possibility. I actually don't know of many good examples for taste-based discrimination or mediation programs.
Yes, I think there's, I thought about that because I read one of the more recent articles on your Substack. This one was not written by you on the issue with range restriction, and this is kind of something that reminded me of the people that I used to work with. I used to work in finance and tech in London, and at one point I just mentioned to one of my colleagues the fact that you don't realize this, but you do not interact with people below 120 IQ virtually ever. And he was flabbergasted. Number one, why would I mention that? Probably number two, why would I even take the absurd measure of IQ seriously? But you could definitely see his wheels turning. He was, thinking about it, and I was just kind of explaining, okay, this warps your experience. This is not normal. So, and I also see this effect, I think, in people who are kind of asked, especially kind of intellectuals online, to take serious maybe countrywide IQ data and all sorts of things that just seem completely implausible to someone who has not engaged with people outside of their kind of stratum or their bubble. I know a lot of people going to college. Obviously, colleges in the West now are very diverse things where, you have the elite of whatever country coming and studying in these institutions. And then you kind of have this feeling where you know, engage with the talented 10th or the talented 1% of whatever country. And
Oh,
then,
the talented 10.
yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I wonder, you know, it does feel in a way like it is this, you know, kind of the exposure to these people does kind of reduce maybe instinctive kind of racial prejudice in the fact that, you know, this is a very rarefied class of people that you end up engaging with. And maybe for some people it might work. I mean, you see just the fact that a lot of people disbelieve, you know, basic statistical facts that are out there and have been replicated in many ways just because it doesn't conform with their experience of people from those backgrounds.
Yeah, there were actually several studies on this particular thing about people going from an area of low to high exposure or high to low exposure to other groups and the effects on their attitudes. And for example, you might have seen on my Twitter, I posted one in which people move from a rural area in Switzerland or a rural area in Germany. There's two separate studies to an urban area. And in another case, they move from an urban area to a rural area, or they move to neighborhoods with lots of immigrants to very few immigrants, or vice versa. Their attitudes were progressive or non-progressive prior to changing neighborhoods. The difference wasn't there. There was no contact effect to observe. All of the difference between the people who lived in, moved out of those areas, et cetera, even over very long windows of monitoring, like 6 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years, was pre-existing up to like 6, 7, 8, 9 years prior. The same thing happens with universities. People go to universities, and there's a lot of conservatives believe universities brainwash children. There's not really much to this. The effect of universities on kids' attitudes is minuscule at best. When you have, for example, one design that people use to look at this is discordant twins. This discordant twin would mean that one twin went on to receive a university education and the other twin did not. So you look at the twins, you compare them, you say, okay, which one of you is more progressive? The one who went to school and got all the, brainwashing, and the other one who did not go to school and, worked a blue collar job instead. And it turns out there's no difference usually. They are usually almost identical. The point estimates are somewhat imprecise sometimes, but in general, there's just nothing. There are other examples like educational reforms where suddenly a larger percentage of the population can go to school and suddenly nothing seems to happen. Their attitudes don't change at the mean. They're just like exactly what they were prior to the reform or, at earlier measurement occasions or anything like that. And just in general, these designs seem to coalesce around a possibility that what we observe with the move to education, the move to a diverse neighborhood, the move away from a diverse neighborhood, the move to another country, all of that, the effect on attitudes is compositional rather than contextual. The context is, the new neighborhood or the school. The composition is the people who move there. So it's kind of similar to food deserts in that it's compositional effects driving the phenomenon. And if there's a residual phenomenon, it's going to be so minor as to be very, very difficult to see and thus very difficult to care about.
So essentially, this would mean that people who have a tendency towards openness to diversity and things like that tend to be the people who go to, you know, work in the big cities or at the universities where they also coincidentally might run into people from, but that would not necessarily affect their attitudes towards these people. It's just they're just the kind of people who would already be primed to be, yeah, more have higher openness or whatever factor goes into this.
Right, exactly. That's precisely what happens.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that seems to be the case. It does shock people sometimes to just you know, be confronted with the fact of their insulated existence in those terms. But yeah, I mean, it could be that it's just, yeah, just a selection of the people who are already like that. You've also written on p hacking, and I've had, was it Roy Baumeister who was on the show, and he doesn't think it's a big problem. He
Ooh.
thinks so. and you
Well,
do,
of course, he
which
wouldn't think it's a problem.
yeah, I don't exactly know why. I mean, he kind of said that he thinks that it sometimes happened, but the effect is overstated, and the fact that there's a big scandal around it, he doesn't think that that's yeah that there is a good reason for worrying about p hacking. So I wonder what your case is.
Oof. So I don't want to impugn the reputation of Roy Baumeister. Some of his work has already been torn to shreds. There has been quite a bit of p hacking in his work. Uh, so I don't want to talk about how that might affect his views on p hacking. The issue itself of p hacking is extreme. In the majority of fields, from informatics to ecology, you have upwards of 20% of the effects that are observed are within this mysterious little range of 0.05 or zero point 0.1 if you're in economics to 0.01, which is just significant. It's if you go below 0.05, your test result is significant conventionally. There should not be that many tests below that level. There should be very, very few tests at that level. If you have 80% power, you have so few tests that are significant that are at that level that it should basically never come up. I mean, it'll come up sometimes, but you'll have other tests in your paper that'll show like, oh, this was just a fluke. All the other tests are like very, very significant. Your test statistics they should produce p-values that are much more extreme than just significant. There's no way to do a power analysis that gets you to just significant results. So whenever somebody says like, oh, I've done a power analysis, my paper is certain, and then they present a results like 0.04, 0.03, 0.02, and they've got these back to back, you can be very certain that what they did was they adjusted their results in order to obtain significance because they figured that was what they needed to get published. There is simply no alternative explanation. Um, so this pattern is so common and that there is no alternative explanation speaks volumes about the possibility that many, many unreplicable results are out there, and many, many unreplicable results have led to huge literatures. Um, what Baumeister has an example of ego depletion. This effect has not held up at all. It has been eviscerated in large pre-registered meta-analyses, or sorry, large pre-registered analyses. It has simply disappeared when the effect used to look so big, like 0.60 in some meta-analyses. And now it's around 0. So there are some people who are holding on to this hypothesis. They really want to believe it's true, but it's a literature that was led to by basically p-hacking. But p-hacking in a different sense. So you can p-hack within a study. Within your study, you can go, well, I'm only going to present the estimates that are just significant. Uh, so if I have an estimate, it's like p equals 0.19, but it's directionally the same as the rest of my estimates. I'm only going to talk about the ones that are below 0.05. Simple. So between studies, there's another form of p-hacking called publication bias, which is not just p-hacking, but it's largely p-hacking. What it is that studies that don't have p less than 0.05 don't get published at all. If an area has an effect that people do not want to find, you might get null hacking too, which leads to there being a mixture of papers that are hacked in different ways in literatures. So, and if you're a contrarian in the literature, like say with minimum wages, there are people who want them to be bad and want them to be good. You might publish every study that's p less than 0.05, but with an effect in the opposite direction. So this mixture is, people hacking to get studies that are saying this is bad, hacking to get studies saying this is good, hacking to get studies that show this is nothing. And there's just a massive, it's unbelievable to, um, what it produces is an unbelievable literature. What it produces is a bunch of studies that altogether don't really show you much of anything because they've been cheated to get. There might be interesting scenarios where you have this like special event that happens, like a judge randomly tells a school, you have to start funding more. You have to like give kids, like $1,000 more of value to their education. So like somebody, you have to spend more, you have to give them more resources. And you might go like, okay, I'm going to analyze the effect of this, knowing that this decision happened on this date. And I'm going to see what happens to kids' achievement down the line. And it might turn out that nothing happened, but you have found a way to adjust your data so that p less than 0.05, and this is great, which is often what has happened with those sorts of studies. This is such a pervasive problem that in many literatures, like I like to talk about money priming a lot because money priming is a literature in which you would get people to like act greedy and then they would be greedy, and it's kind of like saying psychologists can get into your head and basically change who you are as a person. These priming studies, it's a little ridiculous, but there was the effect of money priming was found to be gigantic, but it was all due to p-hacking. It was entirely attributable to just fake studies, like picking up results that are not real at all, refusing to publish things that don't conform with the hypothesis, refusing to publish null or negative results. And when people came around to this with large pre-registered studies where they stated what they were going to do with the results long beforehand, suddenly the effect was nothing. There was nothing there. No one could find a single bit of evidence that money priming existed, did a single thing at all, and it was just gone. But meanwhile, hundreds of papers had been published on this topic. Hundreds of grants had been given out that were often for many thousands of dollars that, cumulatively, this all adds up. If you get a small grant here or there to run a study, it's gonna start adding up when, your buddy gets the same grant for, $5,000 and this guy gets another grant for $10,000 and $6,000 here, 5 here, but 2 there. You just waste a ton of money and a ton of effort and a ton of time giving people cash it because of fake work. And the extent of this is, as I documented in that post, in some literatures, if you go by the exact way they report their p-values, which is often imprecise, it looks like something like 60% of results are p-hacked. If you go by exactly reported, which is to say like, oh, p equals 0.048 instead of p is just less than 0.01, then it looks like around 20 to 40% of some entire literatures is p-hacked. When, again, if you're being realistic, something like 5% of your results should come back in that little range that is evidence of p-hacking. So the difference is huge and impactful.
Yes, and this ties in a way to your warning of fearing the man of many studies, and a very interesting kind of counterintuitive idea that one study might be more representative than a bunch. I mean, could you go into that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I love this idea. So several years back, I think it was in 2014, Scott Alexander on his blog Astral Codex 10, which is now what used to be called Slate Star Codex, he published a post called Fear the Man of One Study. It's, based off of that Augustine quote. The idea was that in many literatures, there'll be a lot of disagreements about which studies are right, which studies are wrong. And if you instead go by the meta analysis, you'll be much more likely to get a correct result. Well, I think that many literatures are so bad that if you meta-analyze them, what you'll end up doing is the classic GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You will end up getting a result that doesn't represent reality at all because all of the studies have been they might have been p-hacked, they might have been only published because they had a huge effect, or they might have been published with an unreliable effect that is just so large that no one should have taken it seriously in the first place. But it was nevertheless published. And what happens when you do a lot of these meta-analyses, again, I'm going to mention money priming. So if you meta-analyze the non-large, non-pre-registered literature on money priming, you assume that the money priming effect was gigantic. It's the same thing with ego depletion. If you looked at the non-large pre-registered studies on ego depletion, you assume the effect of ego depletion is gigantic. And even if you attempted to correct for publication bias with one of the many methods available to correct for this problem, then you would still get a gigantic overestimate of what exactly the effect of ego depletion or money priming or whatever it is on any of your traits of interest. So because these literatures are unreliable, the conclusion of them in aggregate is unreliable. when you have one good study, it is often much, much higher quality. Sometimes it's even larger in sample size than the rest of the literature. It usually accounts, not usually, sorry, it often accounts for many of the problems in previous papers, and it addresses them in a way that leads to an estimate that is virtually always much, much smaller, but sometimes larger. And virtually always far more precise. So the big example I gave was if you looked at lottery studies of the effect of winning the unit, there was $100,000 on mental health. A lot of people think if you win the lottery, you're gonna your life's gonna be pretty much perfect. You are going to have enough money to do whatever you want. You'll have any worries in the world. Everything will just come to you and you'll be fine. So the effects from all of these are the entire earlier literature is enormous and it's fairly significant. It looks to be pretty much p hacked. It's like p equals 0.04. It's right on the board. And it's like an effect that is so large. I think it's 3 times larger than that Dolly Parton mass suicide effect. Um, so then these other researchers came along and they had a lottery study that was brilliant because it included people who played the lottery and didn't win. It included a much larger sample. It included a better monitored sample. It included the sample that wasn't as affected by, mismeasurement. Like some lotteries will assess the effect of mental health of people in the area instead of the people who actually won because they can't sample the people who won. Just, at for convenience reasons. And the estimate was a lot more precise. They also had a lot larger range of wins, and the effect ended up being very, very small. It was indistinguishable from zero. It's like 0.01. The population level effect of $100,000 on the help is like 0.1. So it's like 10 times smaller than the observed effect of the population. And it ends up just not being there. But if you had gone off the prior literature, you would have thought that perhaps if we have, say, a very large universal basic income, suddenly mental health will be a solved problem because that's what the literature would seem to suggest. It seems that, $100,000 given to somebody will basically cure any mental health condition. You'll have an effect that's larger than actual antidepressants. And it's a little unrealistic, but it's the sort of thing you would end up believing if you didn't take the more credulous view the less credulous view that really this one methodologically vastly superior study is actually correct versus the other ones that are kind of trash.
Yeah, it seems to me like there are so many layers of incentives and of pressures in academia and in the places where generally these studies are performed that it seems quite hard to take out to kind of purify the material or the substrate and kind of clean it out of the because people do I mean on the basis of these incentives they do participate in these status games and all of this stuff getting accolades in academia getting published and these pressures are essentially what warp the results and political affiliation obviously as well and what's desired in terms of outcomes what is very undesirable in terms of outcomes put a lot of pressure on this. So I mean, if you were emperor of the of any sort of statistical analyses in the world for whatever time period would allow you to make significant changes, how would you maybe make these systems of producing statistical results and probably in academia and beyond more robust? I mean, is there any way to clear out these pressure points to make stuff more reliable, clearer?
I think that it is. I'm always optimistic about these sorts of things. I think that reform efforts can work, and I think that we have some like quasi natural experimental evidence that some things do work. Like, for example, back in the 80s, it used to be fairly common for universities to dissolve departments. They would dissolve like a sociology department that was doing a lot of political activism or encouraging students to protest on campus, and they'd rebuild it, and suddenly the department would be a bit better off. It wouldn't really lose any prestige or anything like that. They would just be fine. Um, this sort of thing, I believe, can be done to reduce a lot of the noise. So a lot of researchers are incompetent people. I don't want to be too crude, but the average IQ of graduate students nowadays is like 105. It's barely above the average. It's the average IQ of bachelor students is at the average because it's become so universal to get a degree. There is basically there's too much low quality. Well, there are too many low quality people in terms of their ability to contribute to the research process. There are too many people playing status games. There is just too much silliness going on. And if you have a high quality person and they have to compete with 20 people who submit a proposal for the same grant, and the grant reviewers aren't particularly bright either, and they can't really tell who is the best among these proposals, uh, you're very likely, if you have 21 proposals and one of them is good and you have 20 shit ones, to give the money to somebody who doesn't really deserve it. Reducing the number of academics seems like a very, very easy way to overnight reduce the misallocation of funds within academia and to reduce the misallocation of uh, talent to academia. Like some people who are marginally gifted, they might be like a 115 IQ. They should be out in industry. They should not be living in like the eternal childhood of getting their PhD and then trying to compete in an ever growing with an ever growing number of applicants in a fairly constrained academic job market. And that's what PhDs are for a lot of people, is they're a continuation of their childhood. They aren't ready to grow up and go off and do things, so they're sticking to academia for a little while longer. And then a lot of them start, applying for over applied positions in departments that are, getting like 1,000 applications for one seat. And the academic job market, people complain, oh, is so tough. I think the good people will be the ones that drop out of it really quickly. They're the ones that go off and go, okay, I'm just going to work in the industry and actually make something. If you reduce the number of seats available, if you reduce the number of places people can go in academia, you are, I think, quite likely to start increasing the quality of applicants again. In Denmark, they once had a reform where they rapidly, like overnight, increased the number of PhD seats available and then plan to increase them over several years. And we have the test scores for those people who apply to these programs. And we see that with the increase in the number of seats, there was a pretty rapid decrease in lockstep in the IQs of the people who apply to the programs. And so the competition induced by having a lot more people and the problems in the quality induced by having a lot lower quality people leads to an academia that is noisy, that makes conclusions that it shouldn't have, that is full of people who feel they're deserving of getting a grant, even if they are really objectively not. So I think cutting back is an easy solution to, it's not complete, it's partial. There were certainly problems in academia when it was a much smaller thing, when far few people had higher levels of education, but that could be a fairly simple first step. It's not really realistic because the people who are there are also very politically active. They're not super bright, but they have, a voice. Um, as an example, in the past few weeks, I'm not sure when exactly the vote happened. It was some date. Um, in Atlanta, there was a vote to expand something people are calling Cop City, like Policeman City, which is a training camp for cops. The city wanted to fund it. Um, the city council heard all of the people's arguments against it, and basically everyone that came was some sort of university student, lots of DSA members, lots of people who were activists, lots of protesters, and they all spoke against it. And then the vote won like 77% saying yes or something. And all these people, got on Twitter, they got on the streets, and they were protesting, saying that this decision was undemocratic because look, everyone was against this. And yet everybody seemed to vote for it because these people are loud, they're annoying, and they should probably be disempowered because they cause a problem for the academics who are serious, and they cause a problem for the people who tax dollars go towards that sort of thing. Um, Otherwise, I'm not really sure what you could realistically do. A lot of the increase in the proportion of the population that has degrees is attributable to changes in how university funding has come about. There's a thing called the Binet hypothesis, which is that basically the cost of a degree increases with the amount of funding available, and that seems to be pretty much true. If you do a lot of like forgiveness of student loans, you will end up increasing the cost of a degree. You will end up making it so the university can charge people more. You'll end up making up class that is not super productive. So by taking on this huge cost, they become downwardly mobile by definition because they have a huge amount of debt. You will end up making people who are disaffected because they believe they've earned high degrees of prestige, they've earned cachet, and they deserve to be regarded more highly because, they have a PhD, they have a master's degree, they have a bachelor's degree, they're highly educated. But in a previous generation, they would have been considered a dollar. Um,
Yes.
disempowering is all I really have to say about it because other specific policies are hard to think of.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with this is, the fact that, this whole elite class has already been overproduced, and the way power works in these institutions is unfortunately not directly tied to competence. So the people who would actually be able to make these cuts or restrict these kind of areas of competence don't really have the pressures on them or the incentives aligned to actually do this. And I'm sure, I have a lot of people who are in academia on the show, and they do a lot of hand wringing about the 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 end state of things, and the fact that it can't go on for long like this because it does erode the whole field in which they're active, and the reputation of the field, everything that we've been discussing up to this point. But they're not the administrators; they're not in power. They can, they can talk to me on podcasts and stuff. And some are brave, and they risk their jobs and do all sorts of weird things to raise awareness, I guess, which, podcasts are good for, but it doesn't seem like they're pulling any levers, or there's, a university administrator, number one, wouldn't come on the show because they've got other things to do. And number two, would not put their heft behind this, except for, it's, I guess, now in Florida or some places where it is an explicitly, I guess, right wing project or something like that, where people are trying to reconquer some institutions, but these, you can count them on the fingers of one hand, places in the world where the incentives are going that way. They might increase in number, which I hope they will, but for now, it's I think it's a bit tough.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I Yeah, lots of complicated problems there. I'm really not sure how to address them practically. Because everybody seems to have a lot of people seem to have a broad theoretical solution to a lot of issues. Like somebody notices that certain groups, like women, vote left. They go, oh, well, just repeal the 19th Amendment. That sort of solution isn't really viable. It kind of falls flat in its face. One of the things I really like about what Richard Hanania has posted about in the past, year or so, with respect to abortion, is that if it's kind of like affirmative action for in the left. If you run against abortion, or even if you run and your party is running against abortion, you will suffer from it on the ballot. You will lose considerably just because people associate your party and thus you with the abortion issue. Even if you are liberal on abortion, it's a very popular thing to support. So if you run against it, you are screwing everyone in your party. And relatedly, whenever there's affirmative action on the ballot, Democrats seem to suffer a penalty because everybody hates affirmative action. They think it's racist. Many people will think that, like, if you ask them a certain way, you can get them to say, like, oh, we like affirmative action, or we like uh, methods to remediate racial discrimination or something like that. Like, you can trick them into agreeing with it. But when they actually see on the ballot, they realize what it is and they go no. And then they vote against every Democrat on the ballot and it ends up being a party screw. Um, I think those could be exploited more often, but what it seems to be happening is that Republicans have not learned this yet, and they are going to get whipped every single time they attempt to run and also express a major amount of care about that particular issue.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of energy was let loose with the Trump vote. A lot of enthusiasm from people who really take their morals and their religion seriously. But yeah, I think in terms of electoral politics, whatever one might think about its effectiveness, yeah, it doesn't seem to be a winning strategy. And yeah, it's yeah, I've definitely covered this enough on this podcast. I wanted to also kind of bring it back to the intelligence and the fact that intelligence is seemingly a rare thing in academia nowadays, or at least it's getting rarer. You also had an interesting article about Mensa membership. About there's a lot of people online who like to talk about IQ tests, like to talk about their own IQ scores, and some of those people are members in Mensa, which is one of the high IQ societies, groups, clubs, whatever. You need to pass a test to get into Mensa, and I think it's like the second percentile or something like that. It's you should I think it's above 130 is the cutoff point. But you have
Right, as being the 90th percentile.
yeah 98th percentile exactly, yeah. So the idea would be, I think, in this case, that we might be overestimating, or the members themselves might be overestimating their own intelligence, and there might be some selection effects of who actually ends up in Mensa and why they might be motivated to do so.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Mensa members is that they are weirdos. I'm a Mensa member, but I don't like to think of myself as a weirdo. I don't like to talk about being a Mensa member, but I did mention it in the article just to make sure that, yeah, hey, I'm not criticizing this from the point of not being able to get in Mensa. So what happens is the people who go to get into Mensa are selected for being underachievers. They know they're smart. A test told them they were smart. Everyone throughout their life has probably told them they were a bright guy or a smart person. They can do a lot of great things. And then they didn't. They underachieved. So you have this selection of smart people who also have problems. Yeah, smart people who, for some reason, have a lot of allergies. For some reason, they have high rates of mental illness. For some reason, they have high rates of, like, they're actually so much shorter than average. They are just like a very, very weird subset of the high IQ population. Now, this has been known for a while, and it's why a lot of people dismiss there's a lot of the studies that are done showing that, like, in samples of Mensa members, you can find that, well, they're very weird, so it must be the high IQ is a bad thing for your health. When studies generally show higher IQ is better for your health, or it's associated with better things, not that it's better for your health per se. So what I did was I went a little further. I got a data set of Mensa members' test results. It was a short form. There's the Woodcock Johnson, I believe, and I compared it to the norming sample and using like the same subtest they use, and the results were not comparable. It turned out that Mensa members, their results seem to be overestimated. I don't know exactly why, but I suspect it's because they're the sorts of people who spend all day doing tests. One of the founders of Mensa made this remark that was like, it's really a shame that everybody in this club is so bright and yet they spend all their time playing games. They just throw away their time playing board games or puzzles or word games with people. And as it just so happens, those games are kind of like the things you find at IQ tests. So, what happens is if you give them an IQ test that has a lot of focus on these things game like, then you will overestimate their scores because they have prepared for them well beyond what you would expect for a smart person to do in general. So, they're smart, but they're not Mensa smart. The actual estimated IQs of Mensa members, at the mean level are below what you would expect to be able to get into Mensa once you adjust for the fact that their scores are inflated due to this, artificial preparation they put themselves through. They've basically managed to gain the test. So you have these 2 things. You have Mensa members are selected for being very weird, and this explains This largely explains why you're able to look at Mensa samples and see that they're unhealthy, that they're unsuccessful, that they're not going places, and so on and so forth. And then you have that their IQs are way overestimated. So actually, this low level of health is a little more consistent with what we know than what you might expect if you really thought of them as like a top 2% and beyond group, because they're not. They're like 115 IQ group. Um, they're the classic example of a midwit, somebody who is, above average, but they're not extremely bright. And then today, or not today, yesterday, I found that there was another study where many psychologists apparently, I don't know if it's many actually, many psychiatrists will misdiagnose high IQ people as suffering from some sort of mental illness because when they're kids, sometimes high IQ is associated with like the subjective feelings of loneliness. Like they'll say, "Oh, I feel a little isolated," and the psychiatrist will wrongly interpret this as if, well, they must be mentally ill. They must be depressed. They must be anxious. They must be et cetera, et cetera. And the things they're describing are just the symptoms of providing a more nuanced response to the psychiatrist's questions. When the psychiatrist deals with people who are more normal IQ, people who aren't as bright, they'll give them more extreme and more stereotyped responses that are not as glaring, that are not as surprising, that are not as indicative of mental illness in the general population. And those people will be underdiagnosed, perhaps, or the people who are IQ are overdiagnosed. We don't really know. We do know that there might be some overdiagnosis for youth, but it's uncertain to scale. Things can go all over the place. This Mensa article I wrote basically added another level of clarification to the point that high IQ people tend to be better off in basically every way. They tend to have social groups that are like just as active as the people who are lower IQ, at least. Um, they tend to have fewer social pathologies. They're less likely to be criminal. They're less likely to suffer from mental illnesses. They're less likely to suffer from a physical illnesses. They're less likely to need uh, like pain medication. They're less likely to have to deal with a bevy of problems that are the hallmarks of a lot of people's lives. And Mensa members aren't really representative if you want to study those hierarchy people. They're
Mm.
weirdos.
Is there any sort of research on kind of how this overlaps with kind of the major personality factors? Because as far as I remember, there were some threads. I don't know exactly how statistically informed they were, but it was kind of the confluence of high IQ and conscientiousness. I mean, could you think of conscientiousness as maybe just a factor that plays into IQ? Is it part of is someone who's high IQ more likely to be conscientious, or are the personality factors just kind of relatively evenly distributed? And if you happen to be high IQ and high conscientiousness, then you've really chosen a lucky number, and then you really are going places. And yeah, you can kind of put your high IQ to work, but maybe the Mensa people are the ones who drew the short straw on the personality factors, and they're yeah, that's why they're a bit
So
outliers in the other direction.
they might have drawn weird straws when it comes to personality, and definitely seems that they have more psychopathologies. So it seems like they are strange. Hierarchy people tend not to be any more conscientious than normal, like people who have lower levels of IQ. The correlation between conscientiousness and IQ is actually meta-analytically estimated to be around 0. The same is true for agreeableness. They don't tend to be more or less agreeable than average. Same for extroverts. They don't tend to be more or less extroverted than average. What they do tend to be is they tend to be a little less neurotic and quite a bit more open. They are way more curious. They're more sensation seeking. They're more likely to go out and look for novel things. And those novel things are less likely to be bad things than a person who's lower IQ and also open. And they tend to be less neurotic, meaning they're not as depressive. They're not as worried. They're not as anxious about all sorts of random happenings in their lives. They tend to also have greater self-efficacy, which is basically kind of you generally think of it as part of conscientiousness, but they're separate constructs. Uh, the conscientious person might, make sure to make their bed right as they get out of it. The person with high self-efficacy is going to see a goal and start pushing themselves towards it, which is not necessarily the same thing. The conscientious thing is kind of like a broad, do you do what you need to do? Do you do, well, not what you need to do. Do you do what you ought to do ideally? And the self-efficacy is, do you do what you need to do to get to a goal?
Hmm.
And those have different relationships of IQ. Along Mensa members, there doesn't seem to be any relationship with self-efficacy. They actually do not seem to have even more self-efficacy than people who have lower IQs, and they might have less, although not significant so far. They're just weird. They did draw a weird bag. They drew lots of mental illnesses, high levels of allergies, which is the strangest thing. They're more likely to be asthmatic. They are more likely to have both a high IQ and a high BMI. They're just strange.
Interesting. I remember there was Edward Dutton at one point was saying that sometimes high IQ and kind of strange factors of mutational load that would kind of lead to effects like this do come together. And there's I mean, I think it was an episode of his on IVF and the fact that, you do have kind of high IQ children, probably also a selection effect there because high IQ people tend to be able to afford IVF, obviously. But that there is also quite a lot of mutational load that comes with that, which would, correlate probably with all of these, allergies, eczema, and all sorts of strange things that one might get.
So mutational load is a funny subject. A lot of people have taken it a little too far. The human mutation rate is 0.5 times 10 to the negative 9th per base pair per year. It varies across regions, it varies across times, it varies with the number of mutations on the genome. And it is not so extreme that individuals need to worry about it because you have no control over it in the first place. And the effect is so small that it doesn't really matter for individuals. The mutation rate issue is a social problem. It's what happens when we accumulate over many generations large numbers of unpurged mutations that are deleterious and have very generally small effects. They're nearly neutral. Nearly neutral is a very commonly stated thing about the effects of mutations. It's a good descriptor of how they are. They don't tend to do very much. Sometimes they do a ton. If they do a ton, they tend to kill you. If they don't do a ton, then they tend to just have a small effect. We see a high level of mutational load associated with all sorts of bad outcomes. What you're observing is an accumulation that is very, very person specific, very sometimes unpredictable. It is, how should I say this? For an individual person, the effect of maternal age, like the age of the father, is not going to matter much. So as men age, their sperm acquire more and more mutations. But the number of mutations you acquire going from men at age 20 to age 40 is 2, which across the entire genome is very, very small. The impact of this is so minor that you could probably dismiss it, and you will almost certainly not see any impact when you compare a younger sibling to an older sibling. In fact, birth order effects tend to go the opposite way. Part of that might be because of maternal age, where, you know, the younger kid is much more strongly impacted by the age of the mother, not for mutation reasons, because women don't really accumulate very many mutations at all, because you have your eggs from birth and they're pretty much unchanged. So what happens with maternal age effects is that the womb just becomes a worse environment year over year. Women who are past age 40 are much more likely to suffer miscarriages. They're much more likely to suffer spontaneous abortions of all sorts, including fetal demises, which are late-term abortions. So another worse than miscarriages. Um, and they're more likely to, have a child with Down syndrome or autism or any sort of error in reproduction rather than the accumulation of mutations. And you can replicate this effect by looking at, so there are lots of designs you can use. I talked about twin controls. Twin control studies, you look at which twin has which thing and see if it has an effect on, another downstream thing. You can look at women who are siblings and their kids and the differences in those women's ages at birth, and you can see that these maternal age effects do appear. And as far as I'm aware, they are still really not to blame for on mutation. The human mutation rate is just too low to consider it as an individual problem. I kind of forgot where I'm going with this. You want to bring it back?
Yeah, I think, even if it's not a significant thing that's, would affect someone on an individual level, the fact that just the typical evolutionary pressures have been lifted quite so suddenly in the last maybe 100 years, I guess at the level of larger populations would lead to change, and just essentially the whole population mutational load in ways that, the fact that you don't really have child mortality at anywhere close to levels that you used to, which obviously at an individual level is wonderful. And, I wouldn't wish that upon my worst enemy, but I guess on the population level, it builds up in ways that I think people are just starting to look at. And it's obviously a very graceless place to be looking.
Oh yeah.
And so,
Mm.
yeah, I think it is very interesting, but also it's not something that I would have any sort of policy ideas about, and I would not want to start
Yeah, it's
thinking
hard to
about,
imagine what the policy ideas could be. Like, how
yeah,
would you
Spartan
bring back
exposure of
natural selection pressure?
infants.
Yeah. It's odd. What Dutton diagnoses as the result the problem of mutation, um, is more aptly described as a problem of, reduced selection pressure, as you noted. So, what that means is that people who wouldn't survive previously, not due to an accumulation of mutations, but due to, just having poor traits, they survive now, and there's your problem. It's, that you're allowed to have a what you call a dysgenic pressure, where the average level of socially desirable traits goes down because the people who would have died in previous generations are either reproducing more or living to, continue reproducing, whereas in the past they would have done so to a much more muted degree or not at all. We've had maybe the reverse, which is a eugenic pressure, but things get better over time. Um, the conflation of that with mutation effects is funny because mutation is so easily understood, but once you put it in context, the way they saw its magnitude, it becomes much more apparent that this is not really the driver of the problems here. The people that he calls spiteful mutants are not really mutants per se. They are just people whose traits would have condemned them to an early death in the past.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that puts a much finer point on it, and yeah, I know we're slowly coming up on time, so I want to ask you the last question, which is the question of the show. Everyone gets this one. It's do you have a recommendation of a thinker that might have been influential in how you view the world, that you think people maybe underrate or don't know about, or know about but should read more of? Yeah.
So I like reading a lot of old literature. I like reading uh, scientific works, papers from people who are long gone and whose diction is just thrilling. It's like the have you ever seen the meme of, oh, someone speaks like a Victorian child? Um, I really like the way the Victorians spoke and wrote. And if you have to read, I'm going to recommend a psychologist here because he was very insightful. If you could go and read Charles Spearman's old work from more than a century ago, like his paper where he invented factor analysis is from 1904. The way that he goes through and systematically checks all these different counter arguments to his points, all of these different means of addressing and supporting his inferences is thrilling. The theoretical development that you see today in psychology and genetics and everywhere else is based on so few inferences. There's so little real theory building. All of the attempts to establish a domain through which a theory runs are so poor. They're so weak. They are underdeveloped. There's so much room to grow. And yet the growth we get is, I don't know, it's like a fungus. It's not good at all. The way he grew theories was, hmm, uh, prototypically like a Toshin. I don't know if that'll come through on my um, voice changer, but it's like locatus, imri locatus. It's good. And if you read him, you will come away knowing that many of the arguments you hear with regards to intelligence, even today, were addressed in 1904. They were addressed again in 1927. They were like the things you hear from pundits on either side are things that have been repeated for a very, very long time, and nothing seems to change. And one of the things he always strove for was to get people to change. I really admire that. He didn't
Excellent. So
succeed, of course,
hear
but
that.
did read him.
Yeah. I have to completely agree. I mean, I one of my majors in my bachelor's was diversity management, and essentially the only kind of empirical basis that the whole program rode off of was the famous stereotype thread paper. And like you describe it, like a yeast, like a fungus, everything flowed out of that, and like literature upon literature bloomed upon the stereotype thread paper. And obviously, as people who've listened to this before know, this paper fails to replicate in any way. So yeah, there's many fields that are like that. So yeah, very very good recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah,
Uh,
no. Thanks for inviting me up.
Thank you so much for coming on. This has been very, very informative, very edifying. I want to point people toward your Substack, which will be in the show notes, and your Twitter, which will also be in the show notes. Is there any other thing that people you'd like them to check out or look at?
Oh my. Uh, I guess just a warning, if you follow a bunch of academics and they seem very, very sure about everything, but you can find that they haven't read what they're talking about, you should probably not care about anything they say.
Yeah, good,
That's all I
absolutely
have to
good
say.
advice. No, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.